Right, good morning from a nice and cool Durban. Just a beautiful, soft day out here. I'm happy to be moving forward with our little discussion on the historical Jesus. Today is session 11, and we'll be talking about some of the contentious issues between Jesus and the Pharisees, specifically some of the opposition he got in Galilee early on, according to Mark 5, and then moving on to some later controversial points that he's quite famous for. I just want to start out by saying today that I've realized and this is the reason why I'm spending so much of my time on this subject, even if I don't feel like, or even just because it's a lot of time I'm spending on this. I'm investing a lot of time in it, without no actual real rewards, no tangible rewards for what I'm doing here, except for what it means to me as a person. And so, this is why I'm doing this anyway, as just to share my journey a little bit. But I've come to the conclusion, I've started to realize that as Christians, we don't really follow Jesus in the way that someone would follow a person. We more follow the Christian ideas about Jesus. I started becoming aware of this, and this is the reason why I'm spending so much time reading about the historical Jesus, reading different scholars on the issue from different versions, different eras, simply because it intrigues me to get behind the Christian dogmas about the person, the historical person of Jesus. And so this is what this journey is about, and this is why I'm willing to spend, probably this is going to be 15 sessions on it, to journal it, to leave it on there. All right, so today we're going to be talking about the opposition in Galilee. Now, the Gospel of Mark is a particular depiction of this opposition. It is a series of pericopes. I just realized, I was saying to Tori this morning, most of my info I get not from YouTube, but from actual books. So my pronunciation on words are often wrong. And the one I've realized that I think I've been getting wrong all this time, I've been calling them pericopes, where they are pericopes. So pericope is a kind of like a short, condensed version of an account with a little intro and a little extra. And E.P. Sanders, as many other critical scholars, believe that the Gospels came together by putting pericopes together and ordering them and connecting them with words and little introductions, and that's kind of how we got our Gospels. So we're going to be talking about some of these pericopes, specifically with regards to Jesus's tension with the scribes, the Pharisees, and the Herodians in the Gospel of Mark. All right, so it's hard to understand why such a big proponent of the perfection of mercy and humility, which is what we spoke about last week, Jesus as a proponent, such a huge proponent of the perfection of mercy. It's hard to understand why he would end up on a cross, right? So what happened? Why did he end up on a cross? And today, what we're doing today is kind of an introduction to get behind why was Jesus crucified ultimately. So this is an important topic. It's an important topic for Christians and non-Christians alike. And there's so many different views on this, and often people create a view on why this happened to Jesus. But we're going to be taking the historical approach here with, as you know, we're following E.P. Sanders in his landmark work from 1993 or 4. After about 200 years of, just more than 200 years, 1, 2, 3, probably 300 years of critical scholarship, E.P. Sanders is still one of the better summaries on the critical historical study of the life of Jesus. And even much later, or not much later, but 30 years later, the books that are coming out now by critical scholars they vary, but they pretty much still hold most of EP's viewpoints here and there, a little bit of a difference. All right, so my iPad keeps on going off on me, and I'm not sure why it does that. Anyway, okay. So the point is, why does Jesus end up on a cross? Now, it seems like Mark wants to put forward that the reason why Jesus ended up, the primary reason was his conflict with the Pharisees and the scribes, because he kind of was against them and against what they believed. Of course, Mark is writing 40 years after the life of Jesus, which is a whole generation later. And one must suspect that some of these ideas have Mark's later perspective in mind. And actually, this is where we get the idea of retrojection. Mark writes back into the story of the life of Jesus some of the contemporary issues that Mark and the Christians of the 70 AD they have and that they are encountering. And as any human would, he reflects that in some of the discussions or the pericopes about Jesus. All right, so we'll return to the deciding factors on Jesus's death on a cross a little bit later. But for now, we want to concentrate on the Gospels. And we want to concentrate on the series of conflicts in Galilee. Jesus probably attracted less public attention than John. Sorry, I just got to check my time now. Jesus probably, according to what we can see historically from Pharisees to Cephas, probably attracted less public attention than John the Baptist. And he also did not seem to attract an attack from Antipas, who was the client king of Galilee, which John did. So by historical standards, most critical scholars therefore conclude that Jesus wasn't actually as famous as John the Baptist during his own lifetime. He became famous afterwards, of course. The disputes in the Gospels seem to have to do with Jewish law, disputes about the Jewish law with his critics, the scribes and the Pharisees. Now, disputes about the Jewish law, and this is now where I had to educate myself on what was actually going on in first century Galilee, because what I've been fed my whole life was Christian ideas about what was going on in first century. And what I like about EP and other critical scholars is they actually go back to see what was it actually like in first century Judea. What were scribes really saying? What were Pharisees really thinking and believing? Because growing up for me, the word Pharisee means hypocrite. Like that's actually what it means. But that's actually Christian propaganda about what Phariseeism was. Not all Pharisees were hypocrites. Like there might have been some, just like there are hypocrites in churches today. But this was not the general tone of the Pharisaic movement. They were a movement for the people. They had no real political power, but they were interpreters of the law. And so we have to be careful that we are not just perpetuating later anti-Semitic Christian views about Jewish leadership or Jewish, the Pharisees of the Jewish religion. That we need to go back and see what did they really believe, how did they live, and etc. And this is what we are going to be doing here today. So, disputes about the law were part and parcel of Jewish law. So here's the crux of what today's session is about, is often in Christianity it's projected to us that Jesus was in this very unique conflict with the scribes and the Pharisees, and that's what led to his death. But the reality is that scribes and Pharisees didn't even agree amongst themselves. They were having these disputes themselves. There were other groups as well, the Essenes, a much stricter sect. The scribes, for instance, didn't believe in the resurrection. They were still kind of like an old school, without the Jewishness, without the apocalypticism. Didn't really believe in spirit world or I think angels and demons. They just really didn't see that because it comes later in Judaism, which the Pharisees seem to have taken up and became at least a version of apocalyptic Jewish tradition, together with the Essenes, just on a much stricter and more aggressive level, I think. So disputes about the Jewish law is kind of what it meant to be Jewish. This is not an exception. It wasn't something special. It wouldn't have attracted special attention either. It's plausible that Jesus had conflicts, and minor and major conflicts about what people today look at as complete minor issues, like washing of hands. Like, well, so what? But in those days, those things were important to the Jewish people, and so there were some disputes. It's probable that these disputes did take place, of course. There was quite a lot of tolerance, and this is what most people maybe don't know. there were different, Episanas goes on to define different levels of tolerance of these disputes between each other and between the law. Before we evaluate the disputes of Jesus themselves, we'd like to establish the tolerance levels of disagreements in the first century Judaism. So this is I think it's a very clever way of laying this out. And what EP does is he gives us a list in descending order of seriousness. In other words, from most serious to less serious. It is EFG, there's 7 of them here. Types of disputes that Jews would have with the law and with each other. So let's start with the most serious one first. The most serious one would be arguing that the law is wrong, right? And it should be repealed and it should be disobeyed. This was a very radical step, and it was equivalent to implying that God made a mistake, right? This is the highest level of disagreement with the law. Secondly, one could argue that the law was wrong, right? There's something wrong with it, but that should be repealed, but nevertheless continue to obey it until such time. But this was also a very radical position for this time. Then number 3 is one might claim some mitigating circumstances in order to justify our transgression against the law on a particular occasion. And one could do this without actually opposing the law, right? So the first one is just blatant disobedience. The second one is obedience but believing that it's wrong. The third one is claiming mitigating circumstances for a transgression of the law, but without opposing it at all. Number 4 is there could be differences in the actual interpretation of the law, and this is what Jews they spend a lot of time here, as I understand, and but in such a way that it would change the law to some degree. Such legal interpretation was alive and well in first century Judaism. So number 4 is reinterpreting the law, and obviously the Pharisees, the Sadducees, maybe the Essenes, and there we include Jesus here, had different interpretations of the law, but this was normal and common. And let me just get to the chase. This is not a reason to kill someone. Number 5, one could avoid or evade some laws without repealing them, kind of like tax evasion would work. So you accept the law as it is, but you make a way around it. Seems like Pharisees are really good at that. Number 6, one may suppose that the law be extended and criticize it for not going far enough. In other words, one could, my glasses are not doing well. One could become stricter than the law, and that wasn't against the law to be stricter than the law. This is another thing that Jesus also does, but this in no way tries to say that the law shouldn't be followed. It's just a stricter reinterpretation of the law, and you could do this without actually breaking the law. And then lastly, one could write some supplementary rules, right? Practices that could govern precisely how the law was to be obeyed and practiced. And so these are the 7 levels of tolerance which EP puts forth. I'm just going to name them once because they're very important. Number 1, complete disobedience and disregard for the law. Number 2, believing the law was wrong, nevertheless obeying it. Claiming mitigating circumstances for some transgression against the law. Different interpretations of the law. Then number 5, we might avoid or evade some of the things in the law. Number 6 would be to become stricter than the law. In other words, to suppose that the law be extended, and criticizing the law for not going far enough. Jesus does quite a bit of that. And one would also then finally, in number 7, is to create extra requirements, supplementary rules that will help you live according to the law. And this seems to be the main practice of the Pharisees of that time. All right, so because first century Jews believed that God gave them the written law, the first 2 categories here almost never happened, because Jews believed that God was the one who gave the law. And I think Jesus believed the same thing here. We'll get to that. Because believing that the law was wrong in essence would be an apostasy from Judaism, right? So it hardly ever happened. There is one legendary story of a man called Elisha ben Avuya, I hope I'm pronouncing it right, who deliberately rode his horse on the Sabbath in front of the temple on the Day of Atonement. Now, that's pretty hectic. These kind of represent a complete loss in God, in faith in God, and of course the law. Now, Numbers 3-6 can be richly exemplified from the first century. We won't do that here to save time, but we will mention the Pharisees as a very good example of category G, supplementation. They were famous for the interpretation of the inherited traditions, and inherited traditions. They would, for instance, use doorposts as lintels to join separate houses in order not to transgress Jeremiah's prohibition for not carrying anything out from the house on the Sabbath. Okay, so get this. Different houses, not allowed to carry anything out of your house on the Sabbath. So they would join their houses with lintels and doorposts, so that it all becomes, the whole street becomes one house, and then it's lawful to carry things. So it's making rules around the rules. Now, New Testament scholars, and I was in this camp, and now I'm no longer. I suspect that many of you might be in this camp, and this is EP's objection. New Testament scholars often insist Jesus opposed the law, or at least parts of it. He opposed the ritual law, and he favored the moral law. Now, this you'll hear a lot. Don't want to say too much about it, but the law can be divided into moral issues and ritual issues. And a lot of Christians just reject the ritual parts of the law, but keep the moral parts. On what basis, I think is quite interesting. But I think even what Jesus says, no part of it will be removed. Not one iota will be removed. So often this is the claim of Christians, my claim for many years, that Jesus just rejected parts of the law and not the other part. He rejected the ritual parts, but not the moral parts. And what we'll see in this session is that is actually not true. All right. So, did Jesus believe that God did not give the ritual law to Moses? So, that's a question. Now let's look at what's called the antithesis in the Gospels from this perspective. Now, the antithesis it's a very hard word to say for Afrikaans people. It is a collection of sayings that speak about the law. It's those sayings where Jesus says, you've heard them say, but I say, right? So what are these about? Let's talk about that, because this is normally the place people and I go to show that Jesus was against the law, right? And EP, together with many other critical scholars, argue against this. And they're saying this is not the case. Not in the balance of the data we have for the reliable life of Jesus does he go against the law. All right, so let's go to Matthew 5:21-48. We're leaving Mark for the moment. We're going to Matthew because the antithesis is not actually found in Mark in the first place, which is interesting enough. But the short answer is that Jesus does not oppose the law in these antitheses. I know the word comes from anti and thesis, so they put them together and it's against the theory, basically. But rather that he argues or requires a stricter code of practice. No one who observed his requirements in Matthew 5 would transgress the law. This is important. And Jesus does not propose anywhere that the law must be repealed. So here they are, very quick in summarized form. Do not only kill, but do not be angry. Do not only commit adultery, but don't even look at someone with lust. Do not commit divorce despite Moses' permission. Not getting divorced would not break the law. Do not swear at all. Thus no one will end up swearing falsely. Not an eye for an eye, but turn the other cheek. So just quickly, eye for an eye was actually a way to prevent further violence. It was a way to limit the violence of this very violent time. And it doesn't come from the Bible first. You find them in Mesopotamian earlier law codes. It was a way to prevent someone for killing another person for shooting him with an arrow in the arm. Right? You can do kind for kind, but you were limited by it. So Jesus goes beyond that. He says, no, turn the other cheek. So Jesus limits retaliation even further. In no way does this repeal the law. It just takes it a little bit further and makes it even more stricter. Love your enemies as well as your neighbors. The command to love your neighbors is observed. Right. So the editor who brought these antitheses together understood them very well. And there's a preface to them which a lot of us kind of ignore when we start reading them. In other words, there's a little portion in front of that in Matthew 5:17-20. Let's read that, knowing that this comes before the antithesis. Do not think I've come to abolish the law or the prophets. It's a rather explicit saying of Jesus. Not one iota or dot of the law will pass away till heaven and earth passes away. Whosoever relaxes one of the least of these commandments and teaches people so will be called the least in the kingdom of heaven. He who does them will be great in the kingdom of heaven. Let your righteousness exceed that of the Pharisees in order to enter the kingdom of heaven. So for Jesus, the law does not go far enough. Jesus was in some ways stricter than the law itself. We note especially the command not to divorce. Now, this is one of the most historically well-attested sayings of Jesus. Moses allowed divorce because of your own hardness of heart, he says. But it's not his fault. Also, the law does not command the hatred of enemies at any point, so that loving your enemies is not a transgression of the law. It is not true that Judaism in general taught the hatred of enemies, right? Let's get that right. The intensification of the law is not against the law. Else the Pharisees themselves and the Essenes were also systematic breakers of the law, because they had their own intensifications of the law in maybe other areas, right? For instance, oh no, that's not a good example. Anyway, the point is, no ancient Jew thought that being super strict was against the law or illegal, nor did the author of Matthew. Right, so this is important to realize that as far as we can see here, not even the antithesis is a basis on which we can claim that Jesus was against the law. This was a version, a way of becoming stricter than the law, and still regarding the law as something given by God to Moses. Now, let's go now, putting this on just to the side for a moment. Let's go to the conflict stories in Matthew. In Mark. Mark has got a very particular version of the conflict stories. There are about 5 stories here, I think. 5 stories that follow on each other, right? Chronologically. Well, not necessarily chronologically, but when you read it in order. So here they are. I'm going to give you the summaries of these 5 stories really quickly. Number 1, Jesus cures a paralytic by saying your sins are forgiven. Some scribes murmured amongst themselves, and they called it blasphemy. Jesus divined their complaint, but proceeded with the cure. Jesus calls then, number 2, a tax collector to follow him. Subsequently, he dines with these tax collectors. The scribes and the Pharisees, they complain to the disciples, and Jesus defends his right to call sinners. Number 3, people ask Jesus why his disciples do not fast, while John the Baptist's disciples do. Jesus replied that as long as the bridegroom was with them, they should not fast. Number 4, on the Sabbath, as Jesus passed through the grain field, the disciples became hungry. They began to pick off the grain. Pharisees emerged and criticized them. Jesus defends them by citing David and the showbread incident in the Old Testament, saying that the Sabbath was made for humans and not the other way around, that the Son of Man is the Lord even of the Sabbath. Last one, Jesus heals a man with a withered hand in the synagogue on the Sabbath. Before anyone says anything, he utters, is it lawful to do good or harm on the Sabbath, to save life or to kill? He performed the cure, and the Pharisees and Herodians held a council, and they decided how to kill him. All right, so there are the point here is that after these 5, I'm looking for the right English word, directly after each other, it's not chronological, anyway, these 5 stories follow directly after each other without interlude or narrative breaks in a specific sense. The result of these 5 is they want to kill him. Now, the question that EP is asking is, why would anyone want to kill anyone for these type of disputes? Because these type of disputes were quite normal for the period. Let's go on to discuss this. There's a couple of interesting points we first have to note about this collection of pericopes, these 5 little short stories that sit in all, the one after each other, and that concludes with, we want to kill him. Number 1, the conflict seems to escalate in severity through the 5 successive stories. the opponents murmur to themselves. Then they complain to the disciples. Then they object directly to Jesus. And in the last, they plot to kill him. Right, so it's quite interesting. There's the murmuring, then it's to the disciples, then directly to Jesus, and then it's we're going to kill him. So there's an escalation. Also, the focus of these stories narrow down onto the Pharisees. Initially, the opponents are just scribes. Next, they are scribes and Pharisees. Then people, possibly followers of John or a Pharisee. Then just Pharisees, and lastly, Pharisees taking counsel with the Herodians. So Herodians is a bit of a murky subject, I think, for a lot of people. I don't think the term Herodians, we find it historically, speaking under correction here, but possibly were some type of delegates from the royal court. But thus the stories also escalate in intensity and in opponents. There's a double escalation that's happening through these 5 stories. The escalation is not entirely uniform, but the tendency is quite apparent enough for anyone to kind of notice this if you read through it. The third point of these collections is that the accounts' circumstances are improbable, and the negative reaction to Jesus seems to be disproportionate to his behavior. And that's really the main point, is that the response of wanting to kill him for this seems completely disproportionate for the time period, and it raises a lot of questions of improbability. Right. So when Jesus announces the man's forgiveness, it leads to the charge of blasphemy. Jesus does not say, "I forgive your sins," but that your sins are forgiven, in the passive voice. And against such pronouncement, there's no law or known interpretations. Jesus is simply stating that God has forgiven the man's sins. In Jesus' culture, the passive voice was often used as a circumlocution for God. In other words, another way of inferring that God is saying this. Jesus announces the fact, and he does not take the place of God. This might have sounded maybe arrogant or presumptuous, because they might have thought, how can he speak for God in this way? But Jesus was confident in his relationship with God, but he wasn't a blasphemer, right? The charge in Mark 2 looks like retrojection. In other words, it looks like it is something that comes from a later time, that is retrojected, backwards projected into the life of Jesus from the time of Mark. Retrojected into the early ministry of Jesus, of a charge that was in fact made much later. So, thus the charge in this context, it seems really unlikely. If scribes objected to healing, the charge would have been much less serious. And strikingly, the scribes spoke in their hearts. We may be confident that this was not a public accusation at the opening of Jesus' career, because they don't actually even say this out. It's just inside their hearts. Okay, so the story of picking grain on the Sabbath seems improbable. Why? This is EP's ideas, right? The Pharisees suddenly appear while Jesus is walking through a grain field. What are they doing there on the Sabbath? I never thought about this one. Like, they just pop out of grain fields on the Sabbath? Scribes and Pharisees? I don't know. It just sounds really weird. Retrojection here is suspected again. Although Jesus' ministry might have raised questions about the Sabbath law, sure. But this is not a chronicle of an actual event. But even if it did take place, how serious of an event was it really? Okay, so let's assume it did take place. It's not very serious. Jesus argues mitigating circumstances, and he cites the biblical precedents in his defense, David and the showbread. David broke a purity law when his men were hungry, and in general the Sabbath should benefit humanity. That's kind of like the argument that Jesus makes here. The Pharisees retired and no action was taken. Take note that the disciples are accused. It's not even Jesus that's accused in this particular portion. He did not break the Sabbath. Jesus did not break the Sabbath, right? Even if the story is completely accurate. So let's assume the story is completely accurate. Jesus doesn't do anything in here. It's the disciples that, with mitigating circumstances, eat some grain, right? The action that seeks the death of Jesus is the most unlikely of all. Jesus heals the man by saying, "Stretch out your hand." There's no interpretation of the Sabbath law that makes speaking unlawful. Talking is not work. Even in the much stricter sect of the Dead Sea Scrolls, which most believe were the Essenes, there's nothing that approaches the severity of this case. all agreed that it was lawful to save life on the Sabbath, although the man's life was not at risk. But in view of the general level of Sabbath disputes in the first century, nothing in the gospel account would have led to the death of Jesus. Right. So what is EP saying? He's saying that these stories, Mark is basically clutching at straws to try and make Jesus a direct opponent of the Pharisees. The interesting thing that in Mark's account, the Pharisees are not even involved in his death. And this sits uneasy for EP, that Mark paints the Pharisees as the central guys who are wanting to kill Jesus, but in the actual account of his death, they don't feature at all in Mark's account. So many of the pericopes are improbable. But even if they were relating actual accurate events, there is not a single case of obvious transgression. And in comparison to the other disputes, these were quite trivial, right? The level of these disagreements and arguments, they fall well within the parameters of debate that were accepted in Jesus' time. And this is the point that EP is making. These type of disputes, they fall within acceptable tolerances. It was more normal. This happened in first century Judaism. It was not the case. It seems improbable, unlikely historically, that this is the reason why Jesus is crucified, because he disagrees on the interpretation of the law. All right. So, accepting the arguments above, how do we understand the existence of these passages? Like, how, if we were saying that a lot of these are improbable and they were kind of exaggerated to get the Pharisees to hate Jesus and plot to kill them, how do we think about how these passages came together and were put in this order in the Gospel of Mark? They must originate from somewhere, obviously. We may ask, where does the collection come from? Where do the individual pericopes come from? And are the individual pericopes integral or composite? And do they belong together in the first place? So, number one, the collection makes it seem like the Pharisees were out to get Jesus from the early stages, and they pursued him relentlessly, like they pop up in grain fields, right? The collection is the work of Mark, or maybe a previous author that Mark uses. But the sequence of stories where one confrontation follows on the other without intervening narrative or discussion increases steadily and increasingly steadily. Let me just read that again. The sequences of stories where one confrontation follows on the other without an intervening narrative or discussion, increasing steadily levels of attack, is dramatic but artificial. The underlying events were probably far apart and were placed together to have this dramatic escalating effect. I think that's a reasonable conclusion. Number two, we don't assume that they all really took place. Retrojection might be at play. Later Christian versus Pharisee disputes thrust back into the lifetime of Jesus. We note that twice in this selection, it is the followers that are accused and not Jesus, interestingly. We note that thus the disputes might have taken place, but not necessarily between Jesus and the Pharisees, but possibly later between the Christians of Mark's era and the Pharisees, and Mark retrojects that back into the life of Jesus. Very creative literature that Mark is writing, and it's, once you realize that Mark is not a strictly historical account, then the doors for these type of things open and they become quite likely. It just makes a heck of a lot more sense. It does not seem to us that Mark wanted stories in which Jesus criticized the law and was criticized by the Jews and having positive relations. It does seem to us that Mark wanted stories in which Jesus criticized the law and was criticized by the Jews and having positive relations with Gentiles. But these were hard to come by, and he made the best of what he could get. Got creative, right? It is a redactional and authorial construction in which the reader is asked to believe that a series of good deeds by Jesus led the Pharisees to want to kill him. And of course, what that does is if he was this great and good and did all these good things, and the Pharisees want to kill him, that makes them the bad people. The Pharisees are the baddies. And this is kind of what the Gospels do. And in an increasing manner, by the time we get to John, the Jews are called the synagogue of Satan, or excuse me, the children of Satan. By the time we get to Revelation, it's the synagogue of Satan. It's a progressive evolution of anti-Semitic notion within the Christian writers throughout the New Testament Gospels and the New Testament itself. So this seems to me that EP is saying that Mark is painting a negative picture of the Pharisees through this, right? When the crunch actually came, and this is what really, it seems to me, upsets EP, or it doesn't sit well with him, is when the crunch actually came, the Pharisees had nothing to do with his death. And here is a disconnect for EP in the storyline of Mark, is that the Pharisees are the ones that want to kill him early on, quickly, and they pursue him relentlessly. They're there popping up in grain fields. But when it gets to his death, they're not actually involved at all. We don't read about the Pharisees being involved, which doesn't sit well. And this is why he's saying that the earlier things might have been manufactured or liberally interpreted. We see the Christian writer taking a swing from here, a setting from there. What have I got here? A swing from here, a setting from there. I don't know what. Let me just read it as it says. We see the Christian writer, Mark, taking a swing from here, a setting from there, and adding a conclusion. These modifications in Mark result in a depiction of serious legal disputes between Jesus and the interpreters. So, in conclusion then, this session is about the disputes between Jesus and the Pharisees, scribes, Herodians, as depicted by Mark. In summary, they are just disputes you would have found in first century Judaism, and would not have led to the killing or the plotting of the killing of anyone. The nature of the literature, the escalation, the double escalation through these 5 stories, the absence of a narrative in between them, leads us to think that these pericopes were put together by Mark to create this idea that the Pharisees were out to kill Jesus, although they were not even involved finally in his death. And so this makes, the nature of these stories makes EP suspicious of their historic nature, and he suspects retrojection from a later period back into the life of Jesus by the author Mark. Masterfully done, beautifully put together, conveying the story that at a later time Jesus' followers were persecuted by Pharisees as well. All right, let's stop there for today. Next time we're going to be talking about some of the disagreements about traditions, and this is a very interesting portion, but it kind of connects to these narratives about the opposition in Galilee. All right, thanks very much. See you next time.